The message that shook a continent breaking right now, a message has crossed Africa's invisible fault lines, and it did not come wrapped in diplomacy. It came sharp, calculated, impossible to ignore. Ibrahim Traoré, the 35-year-old revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, has sent a direct signal toward East Africa, and its echo has reached every capital that still believes power is something that can be quietly managed behind closed doors. This was not a press release. This was not a speech meant for applause. It was a warning, measured, deliberate, and devastating in its implications. Within hours, whispers began moving through diplomatic corridors. Phones rang in foreign ministries. Emergency briefings were called. And then, almost as if on cue, a confidential United Nations internal report leaked into the hands of multiple diplomatic sources. What it revealed has turned a political rivalry into something far more dangerous, because this is no longer about words. This is about control, influence, and a high-stakes chess game being played across the African continent, one that pits two radically different visions of Africa against each other. On one side stands Ibrahim Traoré, young, defiant, and unapologetically disruptive. A leader who rose from the military ranks not by waiting his turn, but by seizing a moment of national exhaustion. A man who openly challenges colonial legacies, expels foreign troops, and speaks of sovereignty not as an abstract ideal, but as a demand. On the other side stands Yoweri Museveni, Uganda's president since 1986. Nearly 4 decades in power. A survivor of coups, sanctions, wars, and shifting global alliances. A man who mastered the art of positioning, aligning with Western powers while branding himself as a guarantor of regional stability. 4 years, these two worlds existed apart. Until now, because according to multiple verified diplomatic sources, what Traoré knows, and what Museveni is allegedly doing, could redraw the political map of both East and West Africa. And the consequences are unfolding in real time. Before the collision, 2 leaders, 2 Africas. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back. Ibrahim Traoré did not emerge in a vacuum. His rise was the result of decades of frustration across the Sahel, frustration with corruption, foreign interference, economic dependency, and leaders who promised liberation but delivered stagnation. When Traoré took power in Burkina Faso, he did so speaking a language that resonated far beyond his borders. He spoke of dignity, of control over resources, of breaking economic chains disguised as partnerships. And most importantly, he spoke directly to Africa's youth, the largest and most restless demographic on the continent. At just 35, Traoré became a symbol. Not because he asked to be one, but because millions projected their anger, hope, and impatience onto him. Museveni, by contrast, represents continuity. He came to power as a liberation fighter himself, overthrowing dictatorship and promising renewal. But over time, his rule hardened into permanence. Elections became predictable. Power consolidated. And Uganda became what Western capitals value most: reliable. Reliable for counterterrorism, reliable for peacekeeping missions, reliable for regional influence without rebellion. Museveni learned how to survive the global system as it exists. Traoré is trying to break it. That difference is everything. The 72 hours that changed everything. According to sources close to the Burkinabe presidency, the trigger came during a private video conference involving senior African Union officials and representatives from several East African nations. This was not a public summit. No cameras, no press statements. And during that call, Ibrahim Traoré reportedly issued what insiders describe as a diplomatic warning, directed specifically at Uganda. No threat. No raised voice, just clarity. 3 separate sources who were briefed on the meeting independently confirm the same core message. Traoré made it known that he is watching developments in the region closely, and that silence should not be mistaken for ignorance. The exact wording remains classified, but one phrase has surfaced repeatedly in diplomatic whispers: "We see the board." And we see the moves. That single sentence changed the atmosphere. Because it suggested something far more serious than disagreement. It suggested knowledge. The document they never wanted you to see ***, what Ibrahim Traoré hinted at in that closed-door call was not intuition. It was information. Because behind the calm tone of his warning sits a document so sensitive that even within the United Nations, only a small circle of senior officials were allowed to read it in full. A document never intended for public debate. A document written not for headlines, but for contingency planning, and yet, here we are. The leaked UN internal assessment, dated less than 2 weeks before Traoré's message, does not accuse. It does not dramatize. It does something far more dangerous. It connects dots. Inside the UN assessment, the report opens with language that appears almost routine: regional security concerns, cross-border instability, peacekeeping coordination. But as the pages progress, the tone subtly shifts. What begins as analysis slowly becomes alarm. According to the document, Uganda has moved beyond reactive regional involvement and into what the report calls strategic influence expansion. This is not framed as illegal, not framed as aggressive, but framed as deliberate. A long-term plan. The UN analysts describe a pattern where Ugandan military deployments, economic agreements, and diplomatic initiatives align too neatly to be coincidental. Peacekeeping missions overlap with mineral corridors. Infrastructure projects coincide with security installations. Diplomatic pressure follows moments of political uncertainty in neighboring states. Each action on its own is defensible. Together, they form a strategy. The Congo factor. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Officially, Ugandan forces entered parts of eastern DRC to combat armed groups and stabilize border regions. That justification is not false. The region has long been volatile, but the UN report raises a crucial point. The duration, placement, and reinforcement patterns of these deployments do not match short-term stabilization goals. Instead, they mirror territorial anchoring. Troops remain in areas critical to cobalt, gold, and rare earth mineral supply chains. Roads built for military logistics later support commercial transport. Local security partnerships evolve into dependency. The report does not say Uganda is occupying territory, but it asks a chilling question. At what point does peacekeeping become permanence? Economics meets security. The assessment then turns to money, and this is where the implications become global. Uganda, according to the document, has signed a series of financial and resource agreements with foreign corporations that grant exclusive access to key commodities. In return, Uganda receives military equipment, training, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic cover. The UN analysts are careful not to name countries directly, but the pattern is unmistakable. External powers gain indirect access to African resources. Uganda gains leverage. Smaller neighboring states lose bargaining power. And the system sustains itself. This is not neocolonialism by force. It is neocolonialism by design. The West African problem. Midway through the report, the focus shifts westward. This section is the most heavily redacted and the most revealing. The UN document discusses what it calls emerging governance threats in West Africa. Governments that reject traditional security partnership, leaders who question existing economic framework, states that expel foreign forces or renegotiate contracts. No country is named. But analysts who reviewed the report say the descriptions align almost perfectly with Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, and with Mali and Niger following similar paths. The document warns that if these models succeed, they could inspire replication, destabilizing long-standing regional arrangements. And this is where Uganda re-enters the story. Influence operations. According to the assessment, Ugandan intelligence services have been coordinating with international partners to monitor and, in some cases, counter political movements that threaten existing regional alignments. Again, the language is cautious, but the meaning is clear. This is not about national defense. This is about narrative control, which leaders are legitimized, which movements are labeled dangerous, which governments receive support and which face pressure. And Ibrahim Traoré, whether he wants the role or not, sits at the center of this fault line. Why Traoré took it personally? For Traoré, this was not abstract geopolitics. Since taking power, his administration has faced economic pressure, information warfare, diplomatic isolation attempts, and quiet warnings from international partners urging moderation. He expelled French forces. He questioned long-standing financial arrangements. He aligned with countries equally fed up with external control. And suddenly, the pressure intensified. When the UN report surfaced internally, diplomats familiar with Burkina Faso's situation began drawing uncomfortable parallels. The patterns described in East and Central Africa mirrored the kind of containment strategies Traoré believed were being directed at him. So when he spoke during that AU conference, he was not speculating. He was responding. A shift in the balance. What makes this moment so significant is not just what the report says, but what it represents. For decades, Africa's internal power dynamics operated quietly. Disagreements were managed discreetly. Alignments were rarely challenged publicly. Traoré broke that silence. By signaling that he sees the broader game, he forced everyone else to react. Because once the strategy is exposed, it loses its invisibility. And invisible power is the most effective kind. The calm before the next shock. As diplomats scrambled to assess the fallout from the leaked UN assessment, many assumed the situation would cool. That Traoré's message would remain symbolic. That Museveni would respond through back channels. They were wrong, because just as attention focused on the United Nations, a second leak surfaced. This one did not come from New York. It came from Kampala, and what it revealed would turn suspicion into confirmation. The leak from inside Kampala ***, just when diplomats believed the damage was contained, a second breach shattered the illusion of control. This leak did not come from the United Nations. It did not pass through international institutions. It came from inside the Ugandan government itself. Late yesterday evening, encrypted files began circulating among a small group of investigative journalists and regional analysts. Within hours, their authenticity was quietly confirmed by two independent diplomatic sources. What they revealed was not speculation. It was planning. The whistleblower, the source, remains unidentified, protected through multiple layers of encryption. But analysts familiar with the documents believe the whistleblower had direct access to Uganda's National Security Advisory Circle, not a peripheral office, but the inner ring. The files include internal memos, strategy briefs, and recorded summaries of closed meetings involving senior Ugandan officials and external partners. Together, they paint a picture that aligns disturbingly well with the UN assessment. Uganda, it appears, has been preparing for Ibrahim Traoré far longer than anyone publicly admitted. The West African variable, one memo, dated 6 weeks earlier, is particularly revealing. Its subject line reads, "Managing the West African Variable." The document outlines growing concern over what it calls radical sovereignty movements emerging in the Sahel. It describes these movements as unpredictable, emotionally resonant, and capable of undermining long-established regional partnerships. While no leader is named directly, the references are unmistakable, the memo highlights. A young military-led government in Burkina Faso, expulsion of traditional security partners, rising popularity among African youth, alignment with alternative global powers. There is no ambiguity. This is about Traoré. Containment, not confrontation. What's most striking is the language used. The strategy is not framed as confrontation or opposition. It is framed as containment. The memo recommends limiting diplomatic engagement, challenging legitimacy through international narratives, coordinating messaging with partner institutions, preventing replication of governance models. In simple terms, stop the idea before it spreads, because ideas, once proven viable, are impossible to kill. The fear beneath the strategy. Another document, a meeting summary, reveals something deeper. Fear. Point 1. Senior official is quoted as saying, "If this model survives economic pressure, others will follow." That single sentence explains everything. This is not about Burkina Faso alone. It is not about Traoré as an individual. It is about precedent. If a small, landlocked West African nation can break from external dependency and remain functional, even thrive, then decades of political logic collapse overnight. And leaders who built their legitimacy on being the only stable option lose leverage. International coordination. Perhaps the most sensitive section of the leak details coordination with unnamed international partners. The documents reference shared intelligence assessments, narrative alignment workshops, joint risk evaluations. Again, no countries are named. They don't need to be. The implication is clear. Uganda is not acting alone. This is part of a broader ecosystem designed to preserve a familiar order, one where change happens slowly, under supervision, and within acceptable limits. Traoré represents the opposite. Why this changes everything. Until now, critics of Traoré were often dismissed as paranoid or ideological. Claims of coordinated pressure were labeled conspiratorial. These documents remove that doubt. They show that concerns about Traoré's influence were not just discussed, they were strategized against. Quietly, methodically, professionally. And once that reality becomes public, it shifts the moral balance. Because resisting external control is one thing, resisting coordinated suppression is another. Traoré's silence speaks volumes. What's notable is how Traoré responded, or rather, how he didn't. Since the leak, the Burkinabe presidency has issued no official statement, no denial, no escalation. That silence has been interpreted by analysts as confidence, not ignorance. As one regional observer put it, you don't rush to deny something you already anticipated. A clash of generations at its core, this moment exposes a generational divide. Museveni and leaders like him came of age in an era where survival meant alignment, where independence was negotiated, where stability was currency. Traoré represents a generation raised on the failures of that model. A generation that sees stability without dignity as another form of control, and that is why this conflict feels inevitable. The battle moves public. Once the Kampala documents began circulating, the story could no longer be contained within diplomatic circles. It spilled onto social media, into universities, onto the streets. Hashtags exploded. Videos spread. Narratives hardened. This was no longer a policy dispute. It was a public reckoning, and Africa was watching. The narrative war begins. Power is not only exercised through armies and economies. It is exercised through stories. And once the Kampala documents leaked, the battle between Ibrahim Traoré and Yoweri Museveni moved into its most dangerous phase, the fight to control the narrative. Because whoever defines the story defines legitimacy. Point 2 stories, one continent within hours of the leak. Two competing versions of reality began circulating across Africa and beyond. In one story, Ibrahim Traoré is a reckless young officer, impulsive, inexperienced, and dangerously destabilizing. A man playing with fire in a region already plagued by insecurity. In the other, Traoré is a long-awaited disruptor, fearless, principled, and finally saying out loud what millions have whispered for decades. These narratives did not emerge organically. They were constructed. The old playbook analysts monitoring media patterns noticed something familiar. Major international outlets began emphasizing keywords: instability, military junta, risk to investors, isolation. Articles framed Traoré's policies as emotional rather than strategic. His age was highlighted repeatedly. His military background was framed as a liability rather than experience. This is a classic strategy. If you can't directly discredit the message, you question the messenger. And behind the scenes, according to regional media experts, briefing notes circulated to foreign correspondents emphasizing concerns about Burkina Faso's trajectory. Nothing overt. Nothing traceable. Just enough to shape tone. The counter-narrative, but something unexpected happened. The old playbook didn't work the way it used to. Across African social media, a different story surged forward, one driven not by institutions, but by people. Young Africans began sharing clips of Traoré's speeches, subtitled and remixed. Graphics comparing leadership tenures went viral. Videos asking simple questions spread fast. How long is too long in power? Who benefits from stability? Why is sovereignty called dangerous? The language was raw, emotional, personal, and impossible to control. Museveni's image under pressure. For decades, Museveni's international image has been carefully curated. The elder statesman, the stabilizer, the partner. But the leak disrupted that image. Suddenly, conversations shifted from what Uganda provides to what Uganda enables. Political commentators began asking uncomfortable questions. Why does peacekeeping always align with resource zones? Why are alternative African governance models treated as threats? Who decides what stability looks like? Even within Uganda, younger voices started speaking more openly online, cautiously but clearly. The generational fault line widened. Africa's youth step in this is where the real shift occurred. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth, and for years that youth was politically fragmented, locally focused, and often excluded. This moment unified something. Across West, Central, and East Africa, young people recognized themselves in the conflict, not as citizens of different countries, but as participants in the same system. They saw Traoré not as perfect, but as defiant, and defiance resonate. Stability versus sovereignty. The central argument hardened into a single question. Is stability worth surrendering control? Museveni's defenders argue that partnership with global powers brings development, infrastructure, and security. They warn that ideological purity leads to isolation, sanctions, and suffering. Traoré's supporters counter that stability without ownership is illusion. That growth which benefits foreign investors more than local people is not success. Both sides have evidence. Both sides have scars. And that's what makes this conflict so emotionally charged. The role of African media. African journalists now find themselves at a crossroads. State-aligned outlets emphasize caution. Independent platforms lean toward critique. Pan-African channels amplify the sovereignty argument. For the first time in years, African media is not simply echoing external narratives. It is arguing with itself. That alone marks a shift. Why this phase is dangerous. Narrative wars escalate faster than military ones. Because once public opinion hardens, leaders lose flexibility. Compromise looks like weakness. Silence looks like guilt. Traoré understands this. So does Museveni. And both know that the next move cannot be purely rhetorical. Something has to happen. Signals beneath the noise. Behind the public debate, subtle signals began emerging. Unusual troop movements, accelerated diplomatic travel, emergency economic briefings. This wasn't panic. It was preparation, because narratives shape permission, and permission precedes action. A continent at a crossroads. What makes this moment historic is not that Africa is divided. Africa has always debated its future. What's different is that the debate is now public, generational, and impossible to suppress. The old guard no longer controls the microphone, and the new voices are not waiting to be invited. The streets speak. When politics moves beyond conference rooms and enters the streets, something fundamental changes. It stops being about policy. It becomes about people. And in the days following the leaks, the streets of Ouagadougou and Kampala began telling two very different stories. Stories shaped by history, fear, hope, and survival. Ouagadougou, a city awakening in Burkina Faso's capital, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. As the sun set on the evening after the Kampala document circulated, small groups began gathering in public squares. At first, there was no formal call to assemble. No official rally. No party banners. Just people, young men wrapped in national flags, women holding handwritten signs, elders watching quietly from the edges. By nightfall, the crowds had grown, chants echoed through the streets, not angry but resolute. Slogans calling for dignity, independence, and African self-determination. Videos streamed live across social media, reaching millions far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. One phrase appeared again and again on placards: Africa decides. Why Traoré resonates for many in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré is not viewed primarily as a politician. He is viewed as a refusal to accept that poverty is inevitable. A refusal to believe that dependency is permanent. A refusal to wait patiently while others profit. In interviews conducted by local journalists, young people spoke less about ideology and more about emotion. We are tired of being told to be realistic, one university student said. Realistic about what? Being poor forever. An older man, a former civil servant, put it more quietly. For the first time in a long time, our leader speaks like someone who answers to us, not to embassies. Hope and risk, but the enthusiasm is not blind. People in Ouagadougou understand the risk. They know sanctions are real. They know isolation hurts ordinary citizens first. Yet many say the alternative, endless compromise, feels worse. A woman named Fatima, interviewed outside the city, summed it up through tears. I don't want my grandchildren to grow up believing their only future is to leave. That sentiment, repeated across villages and neighborhoods, explains why Traoré's message cuts so deep. Kampala. Stability under scrutiny. In Kampala, the mood is markedly different. There are no spontaneous mass protests. No waves of flags. Instead, there is caution. Business districts remain active. Traffic flows. Markets open on time. To many Ugandans, stability is not an abstract concept. It is something hard-earned after decades of conflict. Government-organized rallies appear quickly, emphasizing continuity, experience, and peace. Speakers defend Museveni's record and warn against reckless experiments that could destabilize the region. And for some, those warnings resonate. The business perspective. In Kampala's commercial centers, traders and entrepreneurs speak in measured tones. We built our businesses on predictability, one shop owner said, requesting anonymity. Investors trust Uganda. That matters. To them, Traoré represents uncertainty, not liberation. The fear is not ideological. It is practical. What happens if partnerships collapse? Another business leader asked. Who pays the price? The answer, they know, is usually ordinary people. Quiet dissent, but beneath the surface calm, something is shifting. On private messaging apps and encrypted platforms, younger Ugandans debate openly. Some question why leadership never changes. Others ask why sovereignty is treated as radical. They do not march. They observe. And observation is often the first stage of change. 2 Populations. One question. What's striking is that both cities are asking the same question, from opposite directions. How much compromise is too much? In Ouagadougou, the answer leans toward resistance. In Kampala, it leans toward caution. Neither response is irrational. Both are shaped by lived experience. Families divided. This divide runs through families. Relatives argue across borders. Siblings debate in group chat. Parents warn children not to romanticize struggle. Children challenge parents to imagine something better. This is not a diplomatic crisis. It is an identity crisis. Why leaders are nervous. Public sentiment has a momentum that policy cannot easily reverse. Once people begin identifying with a narrative, leaders lose the ability to quietly adjust course. Museveni's team understands this. So does Traoré. Which is why both sides are now preparing for what comes next, not just in speeches, but in strategy. The streets are only the beginning. History shows that when streets begin speaking, institutions eventually respond. The question is how, with reform, with repression, or with something more subtle. The next phase will not unfold in public squares. It will unfold along borders, in barracks, and in closed meetings where decisions carry consequences far beyond headlines. The military signals no one can ignore ***. When politics hardens and narratives collide, armies start paying attention. And right now, Africa's security analysts are watching the map with growing unease. Because beneath the speeches, the protests, and the media noise, something quieter, and far more consequential, is happening. The pieces are moving. The language of troop movements, military activity, rarely announces itself with press conferences. Instead, it speaks through patterns. Numbers, locations, timing. Over the past month, independent security monitors and satellite analysts have observed unusual military adjustments across Central and East Africa, movements that do not align with routine rotations. According to data reviewed by regional security organizations, Uganda has increased its military presence in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo by an estimated 12% in a matter of weeks. Officially, the explanation remains the same: counterinsurgency operations and border security. But timing matters. And this escalation coincides precisely with the rise of tensions surrounding Traoré. Why the DRC matters. Eastern Congo is not just unstable. It is strategic. The region sits atop some of the world's most valuable mineral reserves: cobalt, gold, coltan, resources critical to global supply chains, especially technology and energy transitions. Control does not require ownership. It requires presence. Security analysts note that Ugandan units have reinforced positions near logistical corridors rather than purely combat zones. Roads, supply hubs, and communication nodes are being prioritized. This is not preparation for a short-term operation. It looks like entrenchment. Signals without statements. What's notable is what Uganda has not done. There has been no dramatic announcement. No declaration of emergency. No public escalation. That silence is intentional. In military strategy, the most effective moves are often those that appear routine. But regional defense analysts are not fooled. One former African Union security advisor described it bluntly: when troop increases coincide with political tension, it's never coincidence. The Sahel responds at the same time. West Africa is not standing still. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, now openly aligned under what's being called the Alliance of Sahel States, have announced joint military exercises scheduled for the coming month. The announcement was brief. The message was not: joint exercises are not just about readiness. They are about signaling unity. And unity changes calculations. From fragmentation to coordination. For years, the Sahel was portrayed as fragmented, governments struggling individually against insecurity, reliant on external assistance. That picture no longer holds. These joint exercises suggest something new: regional coordination independent of traditional security partners. And that is precisely what alarms older security frameworks. Because coordinated sovereignty is harder to manage than isolated dependency. A deterrence message. Military analysts interpret these exercises as defensive, not aggressive. But defense itself sends a message: we are not alone. And in geopolitical terms, that matters. It raises the cost of intervention. It complicates pressure tactics. It limits plausible deniability. Traoré does not need to threaten. He needs to demonstrate capacity. The risk of miscalculation. This is where danger enters. When multiple actors increase readiness simultaneously, the margin for error shrinks. A routine patrol. A misinterpreted movement. An incident framed the wrong way. History shows that escalation often begins without intent, and both sides know this, which is why back-channel communications have intensified. Quiet conversations aimed at ensuring that signals are read correctly. So far, restraint holds. But tension remains. Why the world is watching. The barracks. Global powers understand something critical: military posture shapes diplomatic leverage. If Uganda appears firmly entrenched in Central Africa, It strengthens its bargaining position with external partners. If the Sahel Alliance demonstrates cohesion, it undermines narratives of isolation and weakness. Each move recalibrates influence. No shots fired, yet it's important to be clear, there is no war. There are no direct confrontations, but there is preparation, and preparation always precedes choice. The invisible countdown military planners operate on timelines the public never sees. Exercises scheduled, logistics positioned, alliances tested. Nothing is accidental. And as these preparations unfold, leaders are forced to decide how far they are willing to go and what they are willing to risk. Why this phase matters most: once military structures shift, reversing course becomes difficult. Political rhetoric can soften. Media narratives can change. But troops, once deployed, create facts on the ground, facts that reshape negotiation, facts that redefine power. When markets react faster than diplomats before a single shot is fired, money moves. And right now, capital across Africa is nervous because investors do not wait for clarity, they flee uncertainty. And the confrontation between two competing visions of Africa has injected exactly that into the system. The first tremors within days of the leaks and rising political tension, financial indicators began flashing warnings. Regional analysts tracking African markets reported increased volatility in Nairobi and Lagos, two of the continent's most important financial hubs. Currency fluctuations widened. Bond yields edged upward. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to get attention. To investors, these are early signals, the economic equivalent of distant thunder. Why investors are uneasy: at the heart of the concern is not conflict itself. It is direction. For decades, Africa's investment environment has been built on predictability, long-term leadership, established partnerships, familiar security arrangements. Traoré's rise, and the growing alliance in the Sahel, challenge that model. They introduce questions investors dislike. Will contracts be renegotiated? Will resource access be restricted? Will partnerships become conditional? Uncertainty, not ideology, is the enemy of capital. The African Development Bank warning: that unease became official when the African Development Bank released a briefing warning that escalating tensions between different governance models in East and West Africa could lead to capital flight, reduced foreign direct investment, higher borrowing costs. The language was diplomatic, but the message was stark. Africa's internal debate over sovereignty is now a financial risk factor. Uganda's economic calculus: for Uganda, this is where Museveni's experience matters. His administration has spent decades cultivating investor confidence, positioning Uganda as a stable entry point into the region. Infrastructure project, energy investment, long-term development plans, all of these rely on trust. Any perception that Uganda is becoming a geopolitical lightning rod risks undermining that trust. And Museveni knows it, which is why Ugandan officials have quietly reassured partners, emphasizing continuity and responsibility. Stability is being sold as a product. Burkina Faso's gamble: Burkina Faso's position is different. Traoré is not courting traditional investors. He is redefining the terms. His administration has signaled willingness to endure short-term economic pain in exchange for long-term control, a strategy that frightens financiers but inspires activists. This is a gamble, because while sovereignty sounds powerful, markets are unforgiving. The question is whether alternative partnerships can compensate for conventional capital. The China factor: China's response has been telling. Despite heavy investments in both Uganda and Burkina Faso, Chinese state media coverage has been minimal and carefully neutral. No endorsements. No condemnations. Analysts interpret this as strategic patience. China is watching, waiting to see which model stabilizes, not ideologically but practically, who delivers infrastructure, who secures supply chains, who avoids chaos. China's eventual alignment will matter a lot. Russia's messaging: Russia, by contrast, has been far less subtle. State-aligned media outlets have framed the situation as African nations asserting independence against neo-colonial structures. Traoré is portrayed sympathetically, as part of a broader global pushback against Western dominance. This messaging appeals to sovereignty advocates, but it also deepens investor anxiety, because geopolitics complicates economics. The Western response: the United States has called for restraint and dialogue, carefully avoiding explicit alignment. The European Union has been more direct, warning against destabilizing rhetoric. France, notably, has remained publicly quiet. But behind the scenes, diplomatic activity is intense because financial exposure is real, and risk managers are asking hard questions. The cost of choosing sides for African nations watching from the sidelines: this moment is uncomfortable. Choosing between models may not be optional for long. Align with stability and familiarity, or with sovereignty and uncertainty. There is no neutral position when systems shift. Markets as kingmakers: history shows that markets often force outcomes faster than diplomacy. Governments can resist pressure, populations can endure hardship, but sustained economic isolation reshapes politics. Traoré knows this, Museveni knows this, which makes their next moves even more critical. The clock is ticking every day. Uncertainty persists, costs accumulate. Loans become more expensive, projects pause, confidence erodes. Eventually, something gives. The question is, who adapts and who blinks? Global powers. The quiet hands behind the curtain. When a conflict between African leaders begins to intensify, it rarely stays purely African. The continent is not isolated. It never was. Africa is intertwined with global supply chains, security partnerships, and geopolitical competition. And the confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Yoweri Museveni has already attracted attention from the world's most powerful capitals. But what makes this moment different is the subtlety, because the most decisive actions are not always loud. Sometimes, the most powerful forces are those that don't speak at all. China's silence. Strategic patience. China's response to the crisis has been one of the most closely watched developments. Beijing has significant investments in both Uganda and Burkina Faso, and it has built its Africa strategy on long-term stability and predictable partnership. China does not thrive on chaos. It thrives on consistent access. Yet Chinese state media has published only a few short, neutral pieces on the situation, with no clear alignment to either side. This silence is not indifference. It is strategy. China is watching to see which side can deliver stability and access, and which side will collapse into crisis. The question Beijing is likely asking is, who will protect Chinese interests in the long term? China's decision will matter because it can influence infrastructure, financing, trade routes, diplomatic support, security cooperation. If China leans toward Traoré, it would signal support for sovereignty movements and could shift the balance of power across the Sahel. If China leans toward Museveni, it would reinforce the stability-first model and strengthen existing regional frameworks. For now, China waits. Russia's open support. Russia has been more direct. Russian state media has framed the conflict as a struggle against neo-colonial influence and has portrayed Traoré sympathetically. Moscow's narrative fits its broader geopolitical goal of weakening Western influence globally. This support matters for two reasons. Symbolic legitimacy. Russia's message bolsters Traoré's image among sovereignty-minded populations. Material influence. Russia's involvement could translate into security and diplomatic support, not necessarily direct military aid, but assistance through alliances, weapons procurement, and international lobbying. However, Russia's support also complicates Traoré's position, because aligning too openly with Moscow risks further isolating Burkina Faso from Western markets and international financial systems. It is a double-edged sword. The United States. A diplomatic tightrope. The United States has issued statements calling for restraint and dialogue, carefully avoiding direct alignment. This cautious stance reflects Washington's challenge. Supporting Museveni maintains stability and existing security cooperation. Supporting Traoré signals support for sovereignty movements and undermines long-standing partnerships. The U.S. cannot openly endorse either side without creating a ripple effect. Because if the U.S. appears to favor Museveni, it risks being seen as supporting suppression of new African leadership models. If it appears to support Traoré, it risks destabilizing a partner and encouraging anti-Western narratives. So the U.S. chooses diplomacy. For now. Europe's uneasy position. European Union representatives have issued warnings against destabilizing rhetoric, and the EU's chief diplomat has emphasized the importance of stability without naming specific leaders. France, however, has remained largely silent publicly. That silence has fueled speculation. France has a history of deep involvement in West Africa. Even without public statements, sources suggest intense behind-the-scenes diplomacy is happening. France is watching closely because the stakes are high. A successful sovereignty movement in Burkina Faso could inspire similar movements in other former French colonies. That could disrupt economic agreements, military bases, and political influence. So France's silence may not be neutrality. It may be calculation. The hidden battleground. The most dangerous element in this global involvement is not the statements. It is the hidden battleground. Intelligence sharing, military logistics, financial pressure, diplomatic isolation. These tools are not visible to the public, but they shape outcomes more effectively than public speeches. And if the leaked documents are accurate, Uganda is already playing this game. The power of alignment. This conflict is not simply about two African leaders. It is about the alignment of global interests. If the old model wins, the continent remains a series of managed zones, each with its own stability, but limited sovereignty. If the new model wins, Africa could shift toward collective bargaining, resource control, and greater autonomy. That is why global powers are not simply watching. They are choosing. The question of leverage. The central question is, who has more leverage? Museveni has access to existing security partnerships, infrastructure projects, and long-term diplomatic relationships. Traoré has moral momentum, popular support, and a narrative that resonates with millions. But in global politics, momentum is not always enough. Power is measured in access, and access is measured in monologistics. International legitimacy. The balance of risk. The world's major powers are weighing risks. Supporting Traoré could disrupt established systems. Supporting Museveni could alienate a new generation of Africans. Remaining neutral could mean losing influence to rivals. In the global chessboard, Africa is not a background. It is the central board. The third document. The proposal that was buried. The story doesn't end with leaked reports or secret memos. Because there is a third document, and this one might be the most significant of all. A document that reveals the real fault line beneath the conflict. A proposal that was circulated quietly among African Union members months before any of this became public, and then shelved. And it's the kind of proposal that would make powerful people nervous, because it threatens to change the rules of engagement entirely. The proposal that never made it to the table. The document was authored by a coalition of younger African leaders and civil society organizations. It was designed as a blueprint for a new African order, one that shifts power away from external dependencies and toward collective bargaining. The proposal called for resource sovereignty. African nations would collectively negotiate resource contracts instead of individual states being forced to accept unequal terms. Collective bargaining power. A unified African approach to foreign investment and trade agreements. New frameworks for military partnership. Security cooperation would be managed under African-led institutions rather than through bilateral deals with foreign powers. Stronger regional integration, reducing reliance on former colonial powers and encouraging intra-African trade. The proposal was radical, not because it was violent, but because it was realistic. It acknowledged that the old system was designed to keep Africa divided and dependent, and it offered a way out. Why it was shelved? According to insiders, the proposal was not rejected because it lacked merit. It was shelved because it threatened the status quo. Old leaders argued that the plan was unrealistic, too disruptive, and could damage relationships built over decades. But the truth is deeper. It threatened to dismantle the influence of external actors, and with that, the leverage of leaders who benefited from those relationships. The older leadership saw the proposal as a threat to the established order, a threat to the slow, controlled evolution of African sovereignty. And that's where Museveni's opposition matters. Museveni's role. Sources indicate that Museveni was among the leaders who opposed the proposal most strongly. He argued that it would destabilize the continent and risk isolating nations from global partnerships. To him, the proposal was not a blueprint for liberation. It was a blueprint for chaos. Whether that view is accurate or not depends on your perspective. But what matters is that the proposal was a threat to the kind of leadership Museveni represents. A leadership that has survived by balancing international relationships and maintaining stability. Traoré's supporter, on the other hand, was one of the proposal's strongest supporters. He believed it represented a path forward for Africa, a way to break free from economic dependence and regain control over resources, and he didn't just support it verbally. Sources suggest he began quietly mobilizing support among other younger leaders and civil society groups. This is why his actions in the past weeks may not be random. It possible that Traoré is using this moment to revive the proposal and build momentum for a fundamental shift in Africa's global position. The real reason behind the conflict, if this is true, then what we are witnessing is not a personal rivalry. It is a power struggle over the future of African governance. The conflict is not simply between Traoré and Museveni. It is between two competing visions of Africa. One vision, a continent that stays within the existing global order, stable, predictable, and dependent. The other vision, a continent that seeks autonomy, willing to risk short-term instability for long-term sovereignty. Why the proposal matters more than the leaks and memos are important because they reveal the tactics, but the proposal reveals the goal. And that goal is the real threat to the old system, because if the proposal succeeds, the entire structure of influence shifts. External actors can no longer negotiate with individual states as easily. They must negotiate with a united continent. And that changes everything. Traoré as a catalyst. Traoré's role in this is critical. He is not simply a revolutionary leader. He is a catalyst. A symbol of a new generation that refuses to accept the terms of the old game. If he succeeds in reviving the proposal, it will not just be Burkina Faso that changes. It will be the entire continent. And that is why the stakes are so high. The old guards fear this is why leaders like Museveni fear him. Not because Traoré is dangerous, but because he is contagious. The proposal is not just a policy. It is a blueprint for a new African identity. An identity is harder to control than politics. The moment of truth. The conflict between Traoré and Museveni is therefore not a regional dispute. It is a test. A test of whether Africa will continue to accept external influence as inevitable, or whether it will attempt to define its own future. Proposal may have been shelved, but the idea cannot be buried because once an idea exists, it cannot be erased. The ideological clash. Experts speak **** to understand the conflict between Ibrahim Traoré and Yoweri Museveni. We need to hear from the people who study the continent's politics, the professors, analysts, and diplomats who have spent decades observing Africa's patterns, because this is not simply a clash of personalities. It's a clash of ideologies. Dr. Amara Okonkwo. The generational shift. This morning, Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a professor of African political systems at the University of Accra, provided a perspective that many analysts believe is the most accurate. She said, "What we are witnessing is a generational clash." According to her, Museveni represents the old guard, liberation fighters who took power decades ago and never let go. Leaders who built their legitimacy on fighting colonialism, but then replicated many of the same power structures. Traoré, on the other hand, represents something new. He is not asking for permission. He is not playing by the diplomatic rules that were written by the very powers he is challenging. That makes him dangerous, but inspiring, because for the first time in decades, young Africans see a leader who does not speak in diplomatic code. A leader who speaks plainly. Ambassador Charles Matabi. The stability argument. Not everyone agrees with Dr. Okonkwo. Ambassador Charles Matabi, a former Ugandan diplomat, pushed back strongly in an interview this afternoon. He argued, "This narrative that paints Museveni as some kind of puppet is deeply unfair and frankly ignorant of history." Matabi's point is that Museveni has maintained stability in Uganda for nearly 4 decades. He has brought infrastructure development, economic growth, and regional peace. He warned, "The alternative isn't some romantic revolution. It's chaos." To Matabi, the conflict is not about colonialism or sovereignty. It is about pragmatism. He argues that Uganda's stability is not a product of foreign influence, but a result of strong leadership. The middle ground. The African analyst's perspective. Between these two perspectives lies a broader, more nuanced view. A senior analyst from a major African think tank, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the situation as a strategic dilemma. He explained, "Museveni's model has worked in many ways. Uganda is more stable than many of its neighbors, but that stability has been purchased with compromises." According to him, the problem is not that Museveni is corrupt or controlled. The problem is that his model is no longer sustainable in a changing world. The old bargain, stability in exchange for access and partnership, is breaking down because Africa's youth are no longer willing to accept it. The youth perspective across Africa, young people are not just spectators. They are participants in this ideological clash. They have grown up in a world of social media, global awareness, and increased frustration with economic inequality. For many, Traoré is not an ideological figure. He is a symbol. A symbol of resistance. A symbol of refusal. The youth are not asking for a perfect system. They are asking for one that belongs to them. The risk of romanticizing, but it's important to note that not all experts believe Traoré is the answer. A historian specializing in African military regimes warned that military-led governments often start with revolutionary rhetoric and end in authoritarianism. Warning is simple. Revolution is easy. Governance is hard. This perspective reminds us that the conflict is not between good and evil. It's between two imperfect systems, both with risks. The role of regional institutions. Another crucial perspective comes from an African Union advisor who argues that the AU's weakness is part of the problem. He said, "The AU has long lacked the capacity to enforce regional stability without external support." According to him, the conflict between Traoré and Museveni highlights the need for African institutions to become stronger, more independent, and more capable of managing internal disputes. But that requires resources and unity, two things that are hard to achieve when the continent is divided. The question of legitimacy. Ultimately, the conflict is a battle for legitimacy. Museveni's legitimacy is rooted in longevity, stability, international recognition. Traoré's legitimacy is rooted in youth, symbolism, defiance. Both forms of legitimacy have power, and both forms can crumble. The ideological divide. In simple terms, if we simplify the clash into a single sentence, Museveni believes stability is the foundation of progress. Traoré believes sovereignty is the foundation of progress. Both are correct in their own way, but the tension comes when stability is maintained at the cost of sovereignty, or sovereignty is pursued at the cost of stability. What experts agree on. Despite disagreement, experts share a common belief. This conflict is not going away. It is a turning point. A moment where the future direction of African governance is being decided, not by outside powers, but by African leaders and citizens, and the outcome will shape the continent for decades. The human cost. Africa's emotional and economic reality ***. So far, we've focused on documents, strategy, and power dynamics. But this conflict is not just political. It's personal. Because behind every leak, every troop movement, and every diplomatic statement, there are millions of ordinary Africans living in uncertainty, caught between two visions of the future. And their lives are already being affected. The emotional reality political conflict always creates emotional stress. But this situation is different because it challenges identity. It forces people to choose. Do you want stability even if it means compromise? Or do you want sovereignty even if it risks uncertainty? Those questions are not theoretical. They shape how people feel about their own country, their own leaders, and their own future. The Burkina Faso experience. In Burkina Faso, the emotional climate is a mixture of hope and fear. Hope because Traoré's message resonates deeply with a population tired of external interference. Fear because they know the cost of standing against powerful international interests. In villages outside Ouagadougou, farmers have been talking openly about a future they never dared imagine. For the first time, some believe they might not need to send their children away. But the fear is real. The fear of sanctions. The fear of isolation. The fear that their country could become a test case, and that tests often fail. The Kampala experience in Uganda, the emotional climate is different, but no less intense. For many Ugandans, Museveni represents stability and order. A leader who ended chaos and kept the country intact. But younger Ugandans are questioning whether stability has become stagnation. They see a country that has improved in infrastructure and security, but still struggles with inequality and restricted political space. They feel the tension between gratitude for peace and frustration at lack of change, and that tension is growing. The economic reality. Emotional stress is one thing. Economic hardship is another. In Burkina Faso, the economy is fragile. Sanctions or reduced foreign aid could have immediate consequences, particularly on food security, healthcare, and education, and the risk of economic pressure is real. Even the perception of instability can reduce investment, halt development projects, and worsen unemployment. Traoré understands this risk, and his supporters know it too. But they argue that the cost of dependency is already too high. The business world in Cameroon and neighboring countries like Cameroon, traders and business owners are watching the conflict closely. Cameroon's markets are connected to West African supply chains, and any disruption in the Sahel impacts prices and transport routes. One trader in Douala said, "If borders close or security worsens, everything becomes expensive." The economic ripple effects spread far beyond the immediate conflict zones, and that's why even countries not directly involved are paying attention. The psychological toll. Conflict creates psychological pressure. People begin to feel uncertain about the future of their children. They fear the return of instability. They worry about the cost of imported goods. They fear being punished for politics they did not choose. This pressure can create resentment, anger, and division, and it can be used as a tool by those in power. The divide within families. This conflict is not only between nations. It is within families. Parents argue with children. Siblings disagree. Friends who once shared the same opinions now argue about who is right. These divides are not temporary. They reflect deeper disagreements about what Africa should be. And those disagreements are not easy to resolve. The role of social media has amplified these divisions. What used to be private conversations are now public debates. People who might never have spoken politically are now sharing opinions, reposting memes, and participating in arguments that shape identity. The online environment is emotional, fast, and unforgiving, and it accelerates polarization. The risk of escalation. When emotions are high, mistakes happen. Leaders can miscalculate. Military forces can overreact. And foreign actors can manipulate narratives. That's why the risk of escalation is not limited to borders. It exists in the emotional realm, where anger, fear, and hope collide. What ordinary people want despite the noise, many Africans are not interested in ideological debates. They want basic stability. They want food on the table, schools for their children, health care, jobs, a future that does not require leaving the continent. Their desires are simple, but the political conflict complicates them. Because the debate is no longer about what people want. It is about what leaders believe is necessary. And that disconnect creates frustration. The key truth is this: no matter which side wins, ordinary people will bear the cost, and the cost is already beginning. The question is whether the cost will be temporary or permanent. The Alliance of Sahel States, a new regional power bloc ****. As the conflict escalates, one development has become impossible to ignore: the emergence of a coordinated regional bloc in the Sahel. This bloc is not just a military partnership. It's a political statement, and it could change the balance of power in Africa. What the alliance represents: the Alliance of Sahel States, formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, represents a shift from isolated national resistance to collective regional strategy. For years, these countries have been portrayed as fragile states, each struggling independently against insurgency, economic instability, and foreign influence. Now, they are presenting themselves as a unified front. That unity sends a clear message: we are not alone. And that matters. Why the alliance matters: this is significant for three reasons. 1. Military coordination. Joint exercises show that the countries are moving from symbolic alignment to real operational cooperation. This means shared intelligence, coordinated logistics, joint border control, shared military doctrine. These are not small steps. They represent a new security architecture. Point 2. Political solidarity. The alliance is a signal that these countries are willing to support each other politically, not just militarily. If one member faces pressure or sanctions, the others may step in. That kind of solidarity reduces the effectiveness of external pressure. Point 3. Economic cooperation. The Sahel is not rich in infrastructure, but it is rich in strategic value. The alliance could develop shared trade routes, shared security resources, collective bargaining power. Even small steps in economic integration would weaken the old model of dependency. The alliance and the Traoré effect. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership is widely seen as a catalyst for the alliance. His defiance and willingness to challenge the old system has given other Sahel states confidence, and now the alliance is no longer a symbolic statement. It is a potential geopolitical shift. Why the alliance threatens the old order. The old order relies on division. It relies on the idea that each country is weak alone. The alliance breaks that. When countries unite, external powers cannot negotiate the same way. They cannot use divide and rule tactics as easily. They must face a collective voice. The risks of the alliance. But unity is not without risks. The Sahel is already facing severe security challenges. Coordination requires resources, trust, and stability. If the alliance fails to deliver results, it could weaken public support. And if external pressure increases, the alliance could fracture. Unity is difficult, especially under stress. How the alliance changes calculations for Museveni and Uganda. The alliance creates a strategic problem. If the Sahel bloc continues to grow, it will be harder to isolate Burkina Faso. It also sends a signal to other African countries that they can form regional partnerships outside of traditional frameworks. This reduces the influence of East African leadership that depends on those frameworks. The international response. International reactions to the alliance have been cautious. Some global powers have labeled it worrying, implying that stability may be threatened. Others have avoided public comment, because the alliance represents a shift in regional power that could destabilize long-standing partnerships. The future of regional cooperation. Alliance may be the first step toward deeper regional integration. If it succeeds, it could inspire similar blocs across Africa. If it fails, it could become a cautionary tale, strengthening the old order. Either way, it is a turning point. The real question is not whether the alliance exists. It does. The question is whether it can sustain itself, and whether it can deliver security and economic stability. Because without those, unity becomes symbolic, not strategic. What happens next? The scenarios that will shape Africa ***. We've now seen the leak, the response, the emotions, the regional alliances, and the global reaction. Now comes the most critical part: what happens next? Because this conflict isn't just a story. It's a turning point. And the next moves will determine Africa's direction for decades. Scenario 1. Diplomacy wins, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the leaders retreat from public confrontation. They use diplomatic channels. The result: a ceasefire in rhetoric, negotiations behind closed doors, a new set of agreements that reduce tension. Why it's likely? No one wants full-scale conflict. Not Burkina Faso. Not Uganda. Not the African Union. Not foreign powers. The cost is too high, but this scenario has a hidden truth. It may not solve the root issue. It may only postpone the conflict, because the underlying problem remains: the old system versus the new movement. Scenario 2. The pressure campaign, the most dangerous outcome. In this scenario, Uganda and its allies increase pressure on Burkina Faso. This could include economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, cyber and influence operations, support for internal opposition. The goal: to weaken Traoré's influence without openly declaring war. The risk: this could backfire. If the people of Burkina Faso feel threatened, they may become more unified, and pressure often strengthens resistance. Scenario 3. Regional escalation, the real possibility. This is the scenario most analysts fear. If tensions rise, regional conflict could become inevitable. A miscalculation or a provocation could trigger military escalation. And once conflict begins, it spreads, because alliances become activated, borders become vulnerable, and the old system's divide and rule strategy becomes weaponized. Scenario 4. A new African order, the revolutionary outcome. This is the scenario Traoré supporters believe in. It involves a complete shift in how Africa deals with foreign powers. It includes collective bargaining, resource sovereignty, new security frameworks, new economic alliances. This outcome would be a revolution in African geopolitics. But it requires leadership, unity, trust, long-term strategy, sacrifice, and those are difficult to sustain. Scenario 5. The status quo returns, the conservative outcome. This is the safe outcome. The conflict fades, the old order continues. The movement loses momentum, and the world returns to the same patterns. This outcome is possible because the old system has power. It controls institutions, it controls resources, it controls media, but the risk is that it becomes a temporary victory. Because the new generation won't forget. What does this mean for Africa? No matter which scenario plays out, the stakes are huge. Because the continent is facing a generational conflict. A conflict between the old liberation generation and the new sovereignty generation. This conflict is not just political. It's ideological, and it's shaping the future of African identity. The real battle is not between two leaders. It is between two systems. The old system that relies on external support and control, and the new system that demands independence. This is not a simple fight. It is a clash of worldviews. The ultimate question is, what kind of Africa do we want? Do we want an Africa that plays it safe? Or do we want an Africa that takes risks? Do we want an Africa that follows old frameworks? Or do we want an Africa that builds its own? The final chapter. Legacy, Truth, and the Future of Africa ***. We have reached the final part. And now, it's time to answer the question that matters most. What will this conflict leave behind? Because history is not just made by leaders. It is made by decisions. And the decisions made in the next weeks and months will shape Africa for generations. The legacy of Ibrahim Traoré. If Traoré succeeds, his legacy will be profound. He will be remembered as the leader who dared to challenge the old system. He will be remembered as the voice of a new generation. He will be remembered as the leader who redefined sovereignty. But legacy has a price. If Traoré fails, he may still be remembered as a symbol, a warning to others, and even in failure, symbols matter, because they inspire, they teach, they ignite movements. The legacy of Yoweri Museveni. Museveni's legacy is complex. A leader who brought stability, a leader who modernized Uganda, a leader who held power for decades, but his legacy is also tied to the debate about whether long-term leadership becomes stagnation, the question of whether stability can become a form of control. If he manages to contain the challenge, he may be remembered as the guardian of stability. But if he loses the battle, his legacy may be seen as the last of the old guard. The real legacy, a new African generation, the most important legacy may not belong to either leader. It may belong to the generation watching this unfold, the generation that is tired of dependency, the generation that demands a new path. They are not only watching, they are learning, they are forming opinions, they are organizing, and they are ready for change. The truth that has been exposed, the leaks, the documents, the memos, they have exposed a truth. Africa is not just dealing with internal politics. Africa is dealing with a global power game, and the power game is not hidden anymore. The game is visible. The question is whether Africa will accept it. Or whether Africa will challenge it. The final message here is the final message. Africa is at a crossroads. The path chosen today will determine the continent's sovereignty, its economic future, its political identity, its relationship with foreign powers, and the truth is, there is no easy path. But there is a path. And it starts with awareness. It starts with unity. It starts with courage. A call to action. If you are watching this, you are part of the story. You are part of the future. So ask yourself, what do you believe in? What kind of Africa do you want? Are you willing to stand for it? The future will not be given. It will be taken, and it will be shaped by those who refuse to accept the old rules. Final words, this is not the end. It is only the beginning. The conflict between Traoré and Museveni is not a single event. It is the opening chapter of a larger transformation. A transformation that will define Africa's future, and the world is watching.